We're continuing on this little series looking at how God is preparing for himself a dwelling place. We spoke last week looking at that it's always been God's intention and that he's chosen a people by whom he will be made known. Habitation has always been the goal. Formation was always going to be the method. From the beginning, God had always intended that he would inhabit a people. But it was always going to be requiring a process, a formation. And in this message, we're going to be looking at how God established a pattern, established an order, and the process by which he will inhabit. If we look at some key scriptures in the book of Exodus, we look at Exodus 25, where God makes the declaration, and we see the pattern in Exodus 40, and also Leviticus 26. We'll look at that in a moment, where God is saying, make for me a dwelling place. Let's just look at Exodus 25, verse 8 and 9. And they are to make a sanctuary for me, so that I may dwell among them. You must make the tabernacle and design all its furnishings according to the pattern I show you. Then we'll see this pattern if you go and study Exodus 40, and you will see how once the pattern has been followed to the last detail, how God's glory then inhabits it. And then in Leviticus 26, let's look at verse 11 and 12. And I will make my dwelling place among you, and my soul will not despise you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people. So the first point here is that we see God reveals his desire. And his desire is not a building project. He's revealing his desire for an habitation. If it was about a building project, he could have come up with any design. But this design is very specific to the pattern that had to be established for what is truly God's desire. After God redeems his people from Egypt, then he makes his desire clear. It's unmistakable. He says, make me a dwelling place that I may dwell among them. This pattern that God establishes, and he gives a very clear pattern, and this request to make for me a dwelling place has nothing to do with architecture. God's not giving us a lesson in architecture to make clever or fanciful building designs, but he is revealing an intent that has always been there. And the intent is not so that I can be worshipped or so that sacrifices can be offered. The intent is not to establish some type of religious order that God says, look at this religion I want you to follow. No, the intent is very clear. It is so that I may dwell among you. From the very beginning, God's intent and his goal is nearness to his people through his presence being among them. Not a distance through ritual. Religion often creates this distance between God. It formulates and postulates all these rituals and all these processes that are really intended to keep God a mystery and at an arm's length from us and really inaccessible to us. But God's intent has always been nearness through his presence being among us. Now we see in Exodus this pattern, and I want you to understand this pattern is a teaching tool. It's not about having a tabernacle in the desert to be God's final destination. No, this tabernacle in the desert is not God's destination, it's his curriculum. It's what he uses as a teaching tool to teach us. It teaches us his holiness. It teaches us God's order. It teaches us that you can only approach God on his terms, and that it teaches us that you can only approach God on his terms. Now, when we see this, you must understand God is not learning how to dwell with man. God is teaching man so that man can learn how to host God. God doesn't have to go through a teaching school to learn how to dwell with man. He's teaching man how to become a host of the presence of God and the order and the pattern by which God's presence will come and dwell in our midst. And so the tabernacle, the pattern given, is training people. It's training people in reverence. It's training people in alignment. It's training people in obedience and in an awareness of God's presence. God wants us to be aware of his presence. It mustn't be something that is far off. He wants to, and always has wanted to be, a God that is near. Isn't that incredible? A God that is near. And so this tabernacle, this tent pattern that God gives, is a picture of actually what a people should look like. And all these are shadows and types that will teach us that which God desires to dwell in and what it should be and how it should be. The pattern that God gives us and the pattern that must be established must come before the glory will come. And God insists on something unusual. He says it must be done according to all that I show you. It must be done very specifically according to the pattern, all that I show you. And the pattern is revealed before the glory fills the space. Why? Because I can tell you now, if the glory of God were to come and you are not aligned with His order, that glory will not be a blessing. That glory will destroy you. And so God ensures that before His glory comes, the pattern needs to be established. And here we see the principle. God will fill what He has formed. First the formation and then the indwelling. As I said, it's a school, and the people that God's teaching must learn that God defines the space that He inhabits. We must learn that access is shaped by obedience to His will, His way, and His order, His pattern. We must learn that His presence is precious. It's not casual. It's not to be taken for granted. It's not something we should be blasé about. That's a nice French word that means never minded. We should be very mindful of that which cultivates the conditions and the environment that is conducive for His presence. And that is the pattern. His pattern that He gives. Very clear instructions. And all of this preparation that God gives us is for something far greater than just a tent in the desert. The next point I want you to be aware of is that God dwells among a redeemed people. This is an important order of how things work. Israel is redeemed from Egypt and then formed in the wilderness. This wilderness picture and the working of how God uses the wilderness should be a familiar picture to you now, since we spoke of the harlot and the church. What happens in the middle of the seven? In the times and half a time. In the times of testing in the desert. In the times of formation. What happens in the desert is God's forming that which He can dwell in. But they first redeemed. Israel is first redeemed from Egypt and then formed in the wilderness, and then God dwells among them. God doesn't choose to go dwell among slaves while they are in Egypt. He first redeems them from that system of the world and from the slavery. But redemption is not the end goal. God's final plan for us is not just so that we are redeemed from sin, redeemed from the clutches of the enemy, redeemed from the systems of this world, redeemed from our sin and the consequences of our sin. No, that is just the beginning process required for us then to be formed in the grace of maturity, as we've heard of the 5 graces that bring us finally to the grace of full and accurate representation. So the redemption is not the end, it's how you are qualified. Redemption is the qualification. And formation is not punishment. What God does with us in the desert is not punishment, it's preparation. Redemption is qualification. Formation is preparation. And the wilderness becomes the place where we learn dependence on God, where the mixture of our dependence on the world and our yearning for what the world and its systems can offer, where that is exposed, and now where our new identity as the sons of God is formed. And then, when dwelling is completed, when God completes the pattern and the formation of the dwelling, then God fills it. In Exodus 40 verse 34, we see one of the most significant moments recorded in Scripture. It says, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle." God waits till the work is done, till the formation is complete, before He will fill that with His glory. God only fills that which aligns with His instruction. And then His presence becomes undeniably visible. He makes Himself known. And through that He teaches us that God does desire to dwell, but He waits for readiness. He will not rush the process because He's got lots of time. As we said in the last session, maybe us seeing things in the natural creation, how things are formed and forged over time. Diamonds take time to be formed. You can't rush the process of a diamond being formed under the pressure of the earth from carbon through a process. And God shows us that the precious things, in this case, His intent and desire, will not be rushed, but once it is complete, He will dwell in it. He waits for readiness. And then we realize that even though God walks among them and He dwells among them, He is not yet at rest in the way that this is not God's final destination. It's not His actual intent to just dwell among them. This is not where God ends the process and He's at rest. Leviticus 26 verse 12 says, "I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people." Doesn't that echo of Eden? God's walking with Adam in the cool of the day. Adam fellowshipping with God. And this union. But this walking among you and being your God and you being my people is still not the permanent position. It's still a partial picture, walking or being among you. Because even though God is among them, He's not yet resident within them. The dwelling, in a sense, is external. And this tells us something crucial, something must still be done. There's still mediation required. There's still process required. There's still something that needs to be completed for the dwelling of God to move from an external shadow and type picture to the ultimate intent. Now we learn that the tabernacle is real. We learn that the tabernacle is glorious, but it's still incomplete, but points us forward towards that which is the intent and purpose of God. This city of God that we see in Revelation descending, the habitation from God, the seed of that city is still growing. It's still not yet produced the full fruit of that. And we see this seed in the tabernacle that teaches people, yes, how to live with God. It teaches people that God's presence should be at the center of our life and how we live. It teaches us that God's order defines the community of believers. And it teaches us that God's glory is what shapes the movement and the rest that we will enter into. It's God's glory that shapes this. But the tent moves. The cloud lifts. The people journey on. It's not permanence. It's preparation. And God is forming a people to become now not just the hosts of His presence, but a place where His presence rests, where God remains. The resting place of God, if you could picture God finally at rest in His place of dwelling. You may ask, why is there so much detail in the Old Testament? All the detail, all the finest little minute detail. Why so many instructions? Why so much formation taking place? Well, simply because God is not just visiting. I guess when you visit someone, you don't really put that much weight in what the residence looks like. It's their residence and you visiting. But if you were to live there, you will pay more close attention to the conditions before you live and move in. And so God is not just looking at visiting with us. We don't want a visitation of God. We are being formed and prepared as a habitation. He's preparing a people that will one day be capable of bearing His name, not just hosting His glory. His name at the moment is still placed selectively, but we can see the clear trajectory. We can see where this thing is going. We can see very clearly what God is doing. His desire the process began with a tent, but not because God wanted something temporary, but because He was training a people for something permanent. He was training a people for that which would be the end result of His intent and purpose, the final permanence, the manifestation, the fullness of that which God has always intended now being made complete. The glory of God has always been real, but in that temporal display of His glory, it was only the beginning of God teaching us how to live as His dwelling place. Not because that was God's final plan. If people get excited about a gathering or a meeting and they look for a cloud in the room or gold dust or such nonsense, none of this is God's intent. God doesn't intend for us to experience His glory on such a limited temporal basis. If any of that was real, it would only be because God is teaching us in shadow and type. And let's pay attention to the pattern that God is teaching us of how to host His presence and His glory so that He can prepare in us a dwelling place that will be where He fully and finally resides. We'll continue with this. Join us as we look at a little bit of detail so that you can soak in the reality and not only be acquainted with it, but properly aligned with that which is God's working in us, in accordance with His goodwill, His pleasure, His intent, and His purposes. Until next time, God bless.